Hey, welcome everyone. I'm Jonas working for EclipseSource, and I would like to talk about EMF forms today and give you a getting started, explain what the framework is, how it can help you. Quick question, who of you knows EMF forms? Okay, that's good. I will show a few slides for motivation, and then I will directly dive into a demonstration to show you the most important first steps. So after the motivation, the remaining talk will be structured by the most frequent questions that we get from people who are new to the framework. Okay, so what is EMF forms? If you work with data models and you implement applications based on those data models, you very frequently and very often want to display and modify them in a form-based UI. We have already seen many of those form-based UIs today. For example, in Sirius we have the properties view, which is kind of a form. In the CDO demonstration we had an example application which provides some forms. And you find this kind of UI in almost every application which is somehow data-centric. Obviously the goal is to enter and view data. Now, and that's not only the case for desktop application, but also in the web and even on mobile application. Now, while EMF as a basic technology is perfectly suitable for writing those form-based UIs, it's still a lot of effort. EMF provides support for data binding out of the box, but if you implement a very simple, or let's say the simplest form-based UI you can imagine, which is just one attribute with one label, the actual code you still have to write is pretty much exactly this. That's pretty surprising, but you have to create some layout. Even for such a simple form, you have to create the label, you have to create the text control, you have to bind it, you have to potentially add some validation if you want to provide live support in your form, live validation support in your form. So this is pretty much the code you will end up. Now, let's assume you can reuse this code somehow, which you hopefully do if you create the next text control. Even if you do that, if you extend the form a bit and then have 4 controls in a row, the next thing you have to deal with is layouting. And the layout code just for the 4 controls on the left side would pretty much look like this. So it is surprisingly much effort. Actually, recent statistics show that almost 40% of the efforts in big projects are still spent on the UI, which is kind of surprising because you always believe we are creating business logic and testing or whatever, but 40% still goes to the UI. And finally, I don't know a single developer who actually likes to code form-based UIs, because it's always the same. It's always like alignment left, grab space, you have to deal with those layout errors and so on. So EMF Forms wants to solve this. So the idea is, let's start with a simple example again. If you have this UI, this form-based UI with just one control, the only relevant information that you really need to specify is that you want to show a control for the attribute first name. All the other stuff, that there is a label, that this is bound to the underlying data object and so on and so forth, it's kind of obvious. The framework can do that for you. So what we see on the right side is a very simple declarative format introduced by EMF Forms, in which you can describe your forms instead of manually coding that. And that scales also very well if we take the same example, just 4 controls in a row. In our declarative model it would look like this. So we just need to specify which attributes are shown there. Now, looking at the whole picture before I dive into the demonstration, EMF Forms consumes 2 artifacts. One is the data model. In the EMF case, that would be typically an eCore, but it could also be an XSD or any compatible format. This describes the data, so it provides which attributes are there, which types do they have, and which constraints are on those attributes for validation. Then, in addition, EMF Forms defines what we call a view model. That's a simple declarative language which is focused on describing forms. So it's not like SWT or something that you know from JavaFX, it's really only for forms, and that makes it so simple. Now we have those 2 declarative artifacts, and once you produce them during runtime, there is a rendering component which reads in those two definitions and produces a form that you can embed in your application. Now let's dive into the demonstration and answer the first question, which is obviously how to get started. So what is the first step if you want to try that out? Question, can you read this? Is this big enough? Okay. So what I have here, or the only thing that I prepared for this demonstration is a EMF model. I'm not using the library example because it's too simple. I'm using an example called Make It Happen, which is also shipped with every Eclipse modeling edition. And here we find the eCore as presented by Ed before. And in this eCore, there are 3 example entities. Basically, this example model describes a task management system with users and tasks. For my demonstration, I will only focus on the entity user, and user is equal to person, so this entity just defines attributes like first name, last name, gender, date of birth, like those simple example attributes that you can imagine. Okay, now what is the first step if I want to create a form for that? Simplest way is you can just right-click on this eCore, and there is a context entry for EMF Forms, and that allows me to create a view model project. We typically place those view models in a separate project because they have nothing to do with the data definition, so you want to keep that separate. So it suggests me to create a new bundle. So I'm doing that. And now it processes the eCore that I just right-clicked, and it asks me for which entity do I want to produce a form. So I want to select user. Down here I can select whether the form that I create will already be filled with the default layout. This default layout will just display all attributes of the entity user, and that's possible because it just processes the eCore. So let's click on finish. Now it opens up the view model that was just created in a editor. So we can see this editor works pretty similar to the eCore editor. It's a tree-based editor. I see all the elements on the left side, and on the right side I see the details. And now I see I have already a control for every attribute in my eCore. Now, actually the form is ready to be used, but of course this looks pretty abstract. Before you embed this into your application, you probably want to see how this form would look like. And that can be done using the preview. So if I click here, a second view in my IDE will open up. And that's the EMF Forms preview, and this now shows how the form would be rendered in your running application. Now, as we can see, this is already without any code or any configuration. We already have a form showing every attribute, so I can enter stuff here. It already provides validation out of the box. We can see that here the last name attribute is a required feature as defined in the eCore model. So that's why we have this red background here, and only if I enter something, validation will be gone. So all those basic features are already there, and this form is already functional. What you can also see is that there are default controls for all data types. So over here we have 2 strings. Here we have an enumeration, which is derived from the model. We have a Boolean control, and so on and so forth. And now enums and so on. Down here we have a reference attribute, so this is a reference to another element, so I could now add task to this user, which is, yeah, again a special control. Okay, so now let's switch over to the next question. What about layouts? While you could claim that this default form that I've just shown you is pretty nice to get started and to play around a bit, obviously we need some layout capabilities before we can really use this in any application. So let's demonstrate that. That's the wrong one. So let me switch back to the view model editor. Now, so far I've only generated controls, which is one of the 2 major types in this view model language. A control always points to one specific attribute, and it tells the framework, please display a field here. The second type in our view model is what we call a container, and containers can be used to define layouts. So a simple example for such a container is a group. So I can add such a group and, for example, call it left, and then I can add a second group here and call it right. And now I can just drag and drop things around. So for example, I can drag those controls into the left group, and I can drag those controls here to the right group. Maybe I remove this one, and maybe I remove another one to make those equal. So this will now just group those elements. To make it a little bit more complex, I also add a horizontal layout, and I move those two groups into the horizontal layout. A horizontal layout will just align all children horizontally, as you can imagine. So let me show you the preview again. So now we can see the screen is pretty small. So now we can see we have just created a simple layout of two groups next to each other because of this horizontal layout, and everything is aligned. Now, as you could see, by focusing on form-based UIs only, we can actually reduce the complexity of those layouts a lot. We basically just work with containers and attributes, and because we understand that there's, for example, that there's typically a label next to the text field, we don't have to create a very complex grid layout or deal with spans. The framework can actually take care about that one. Okay. So let me switch back here. And by the way, obviously, if I wanted to remove this problem down here, I could, for example, just do it like this. And then the groups are on top of each other. Okay. So next question is, now we have a working form in our IDE. And if we are now happy with the layout and the alignment and so on, we want to embed that into our application, because at the end we want to use it in our application, not in the IDE. So how can that be done? To do that, I will use an example which ships with every Eclipse installation again. And it provides a very simple application frame embedding EMF forms, and I will show you the code where exactly this happens. So what I do is I select the EMF Forms sample E4 application. That would just create another bundle in my IDE. And in this application we have exactly one part. And let's open that. So this part does two things. One is to create a dummy data object. This is just because we need some entity to display in the UI. If you would embed this into your own application, you would load this entity from a file, from a server, from CDO, from EMF Store, wherever you get your data from. So this is not really related to EMF Forms. Now the interesting part is happening down here, and actually the interesting part is only this line. What we do in those lines here is we create a surrounding layout which adds some margins in the view, and then we call the EMF Forms renderer, and the only two parameters that we need for that is the parent composite that EMF Forms is supposed to render on, and the input object, meaning the entity that we want to show in the UI. And you might wonder why we don't have to pass the view model too. By default, those view models are registered by the type of input object, so it can automatically pick that up. We can add the view model optionally as an additional parameter if we somehow want to influence that. Okay, so let me start this application. And now we have exactly the same form in a running application. So again, this is data bound. I can influence the data and so on and so forth. So, and the same way that I did this, you can embed EMF Forms at any place in your application. You can embed it in a dialog, on a preference page, in a view, in a separate window. Wherever in SWT you have a parent composite, you can actually embed EMF forms. Okay. By the way, because I changed the layout, you might wonder how to align this with this. There is a simple option for that, but I will not show that today. I will show that on Wednesday, just as a small teaser. Okay, next question is how to customize controls and layouts. So far we have only used the default controls provided by the framework, and the framework provides default controls for every type. And and also the layouts, meaning the groups and the horizontal layout, were just rendered by the framework. Now, in any real project, I would say, sooner or later you have the requirements to adapt those this default rendering. For example, or typically the first case is that you want to add your own controls. Let's assume you have hex strings in your model somehow. So you have a custom data types expressing hex strings, and you don't want to force users to enter hex strings in a standard text control, but you somehow want to provide your own custom hex field. The same is true for layouts. Currently we have seen that groups are rendered just with a border around them, but for example you might have them collapsible, or you might want to change the color or whatever. Now, while there are a lot of options to configure the default renderers of EMF forms, it is also possible to completely replace them, and that's what I will show in the next demonstration. Because the good news is there is not only one big renderer in EMF forms, so it's not one gigantic class which takes care about everything. In fact, there is at least one renderer for every element in the view model. So for example, there's a group renderer, there's a renderer for the text control, and so on and so forth. And you can now plug in your own renderer for a specific element that you want to render differently, and thereby change the behavior and also the look and feel of EMF forms. The good news is you only need to implement the stuff that you want to replace or adapt, and you can really do that step by step. So a typical project starts with the default controls because it actually provides already a running form, but then you can step by step just replace them as you implement your own ones. Now let me show you an example for that. What I would actually now like to do is replace the look and feel that groups are rendered. Instead of using the standard SWT group, which just draws a border around the group, I would like to have them collapsible, and for that I will use a element provided by the Nebula project called P group. So let me close those things. Let me close this. For time reasons, I will again use an example and show you or explain you the example code for that. So there is an example implementing a custom group renderer. And now I click on Finish. And let's have a look at that. Now, this renderer consists of exactly two classes. One is a service. We call that renderer service. And this service actually does the decision whether this new renderer is applied or not. And we can check any condition that we want. This example now is very simple. We just check whether the element to be rendered is a group, and if so, we return a high priority, and if not, we return not applicable. You can have more sophisticated conditions. So for example, you could check whether it is a text control, but you could also check that it's a text control showing a specific attribute, or a specific attribute of a certain length or whatever. That means you don't have to replace the render for all groups, but you could define conditions for that. Okay, so that's how the framework decides which renderer to use, and the second class here is the renderer itself. It has one important method called renderer control. And this method now is responsible of actually creating the SWT element that is visible on screen. I will show you the important lines. So here we set some background mode. In this line here, we actually instantiate the P group instead of a SWT group. We set the text of the P group. which we defined in our view model. And down here, this code actually takes care that if we collapse or expand the group, that the parent knows that a relayout should be done, because that can change the size. So if this is embedded into another element, then we need to reload the whole thing. I will not explain the remaining lines, they're a little bit framework specific, but as you can see, it's not really a lot of code that you need to write to provide an own renderer. That's a nice thing about this modular architecture, that you just need to write or implement the stuff that you really want to replace. Okay, so let's restart the application. Now the only thing I have to adapt there is I need to add my custom renderer to my product, because otherwise it would not pick it up. So let me do that. This one. And then I just restart my application. And now you can see the look and feel of the group has changed. So now this is the P group. This is exactly what I just described. So now if we collapse this, the parent needs to know that it needs to relay out so that the other group moves up. Okay, let me switch back. Okay, and that's the last question that I want to answer today. And there are actually many, many questions, because typically after those basic use cases that I just explained, users want a lot of more features. Just to mention a few. Rule-based visibility. That means if the user has entered a certain value in one field, then I want to only show a couple of other attributes if the user entered a certain value. Like only, for example, if you're a vegetarian, we will ask about some dishes only for vegetarians. So that's supported and can also be described in the view model. Tables is another big feature. So we can describe tables too, pretty much as we have described form-based UIs. So you can describe the columns, their weight, and exactly what to be displayed there. That makes implementation of tables much more efficient, I would say. There are more advanced layouts. For example, you can split your forms over several pages and navigate between them. You can add tabs. You can have stack layouts. We provide support for three master detail views. So that's a typical scenario where you have the model hierarchy on the left side and show the details on the right side. So that's basically also possible without any coding, and so on and so forth. So EMF Forms has just released version 1.14 now, and it has been very, very active over the last 5 to 6 years. So it has collected quite a lot of very interesting features from various use cases. So if you want to use the framework and you're looking for one particular feature, it's very likely that it's somehow there already. Even quite unusual or complex things that you can imagine. Before I close, I want to mention that today I've shown the SWT renderer of EMF Forms, although the view model, meaning the description how UI looks like, is not bound to SWT at all. And that means you can render the same definition in other technologies. So for example, you can use the same definition to render a web application, or for example, a JavaFX application. And that's another huge advantage, because you don't produce those many lines of SWT specific code, but you rather focus on an abstract definition of your UI, which can be transferred to other technology stacks later. I would like to give a short outlook if you're interested in EMF Forms. There is a talk on Wednesday, 2 p.m. about JSON Forms. JSON Forms is the native web renderer for EMF Forms. So if you like the concept, but you need a web application, you should go there, because it's not based on SWT, but on pure web technologies, basically HTML5 and JavaScript. If you're interested in more advanced features, so for example, in this alignment problem that I mentioned before, in rules, in input validation, in tables, and all this stuff, I will give another talk on Wednesday, which covers more advanced features of EMF forms. And finally, on Wednesday evening, there will be above. That's an informal meeting of the project leads of EMF forms and a couple of other projects. So if you have any questions or you want to talk to us and you don't find us because we're so busy, then you can go there and we answer your questions, or we're happy to answer your questions. Besides that, and that means EclipseSource, we will also have a booth starting from tomorrow, so you can join us there anytime to answer any kind of questions that you have. And now I want to close and ask you whether there are any questions right now. How am I in time? Okay. Then, thank you.